dear listener, I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Tonight, we visit a small university library in the English countryside. The kind of place where the radiators clank softly in the corridors, and the reading room smells of beeswax, polish, and decades of careful thought. Our story follows Miriam Ashby, head of special collections at Caldwell University Library. A quiet, observant woman in her early 50s who has spent 30 years learning to read not just books, but the people who held them, the hands that wrote in their margins, the lives they left behind between the pages. On an ordinary Tuesday in late October, while preparing a donation of Victorian-era volumes for cataloging, Miriam will discover something tucked inside the backboard of a modest green cloth-bound book. A letter, folded 4 times, its paper the pale yellow of old cream. The letter is addressed to no one. It is signed only with an initial, and it has been hidden there, undisturbed, for exactly 40 years. What follows is a gentle unraveling through archive boxes and old faculty rosters, through faded photographs and forgotten friendships, through the careful language of people who once loved each other and didn't quite know how to say so. There will be quiet discoveries, small revelations, and at the end, something very much like peace. So settle a little deeper into where you are. Let the outside world grow soft and distant, and allow me to take you to Caldwell on a gray October morning where the leaves are just beginning to fall from the horse chestnuts, and a librarian named Miriam is about to find something that has been waiting a very long time to be found. Wherever you are right now, tucked beneath soft blankets, resting your head against a familiar pillow, the world outside growing quiet, I want you to know that this is your time. This hour belongs entirely to you. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, nothing left undone that cannot wait until morning. For now, you have only to breathe and listen and let yourself drift. Let's begin by settling in together. If you haven't already, make one small adjustment to your position, a shift of the shoulders, a softening of the knees, until you feel as comfortable as possible. Let your hands rest open, palms upward or downward, whichever feels more natural. Unclench your jaw. Let your tongue fall gently from the roof of your mouth. Now let's breathe. Breathe in slowly through your nose. 1, 2, 3. Hold 1, 2. And release softly through your mouth. 1, 2, 3. Wonderful. Let your breathing return to its own natural rhythm now. You don't need to control it anymore. Simply notice how the breath moves in and out on its own, easy and unhurried, like the turning of a page. Our story begins on a Tuesday. It almost always does, with discoveries like this. The box arrived on a Tuesday morning, which Miriam Ashby had long ago decided was the best day of the week for arrivals. Mondays carried too much expectation, too much of the weekend still clinging to them. Wednesdays were their own center of gravity. But Tuesday was quietly receptive, a day that asked nothing of you in particular. was therefore available to be surprised. She heard the delivery before she saw it. The particular rumbling of the service lift that connected the loading bay to the upper floors of Caldwell University Library. A sound like distant thunder filtered through old brickwork, followed by the familiar clang of the metal gate and the lighter footsteps of young Daniel from Acquisitions, who always walked as though he were trying not to disturb anyone, even in an empty corridor. Miriam set down her cup of tea, Yorkshire strong, with just enough milk to turn it the color of autumn oak, and came around her desk to the door of special collections. The corridor outside was narrow and painted the particular shade of institutional cream that universities had been painting corridors since approximately 1952, and it smelled, as it always did, of radiator dust and the faint ghost of someone's lunch from the kitchenette 2 floors below. "Morning, Dr. Ashby," Daniel said. He was 23 and very earnest, with the sort of face that looked perpetually interested in what you might say next. He was guiding a small trolley on which sat a cardboard box of the kind used by removal companies, sturdy, double-walled, sealed with several generous bands of brown tape. Donation came in. Professor Halsworth's family. His daughter dropped it off at the desk about an hour ago. She said there might be another box to follow. "Thank you, Daniel." Miriam looked at the box. It was not especially large, perhaps 18 inches square, but it had that particular quality of density that old books always carried, as though they had slowly absorbed the weight of everything written inside them. Did she say anything about the contents? She said they were her father's personal collection, mostly Victorian lit, she thought. She wasn't entirely sure. She said he never talked much about them. Daniel paused, with the slight hesitancy he had when he felt he ought to add something, but wasn't sure whether it was appropriate. She seemed a bit sad, actually, like it was hard to let them go. "It usually is," Miriam said. "Thank you for bringing them up." She waited until his footsteps had retreated back toward the lift before she lifted the box from the trolley and carried it to the examination table. A wide surface of pale wood positioned beneath the room's single north-facing window, where the light was steady and honest, as good light for looking at books ought to be. She set the box down and retrieved her letter opener from the desk drawer. Special Collections was Miriam's favorite room in the building, which was perhaps unsurprising, given that it was, in many ways, her room. She had been its custodian for 22 years now, having taken the position at 31 after completing her doctorate on Victorian gift book illustration and spending 2 years as a junior cataloger at the Bodleian. The room was long and not very wide, with high shelves lining the walls on 3 sides, accessible by a rolling ladder on brass rails that she had once, in an uncharacteristic moment of levity, demonstrated could be quite fun to ride if you pushed off with enough force from the far end. The shelves held approximately 4,000 volumes in Special Collections proper, ranging from a 14th century psalter in a custom clamshell box to a complete set of first edition Kipling in faded olive cloth. There There were also 6 flat plan drawers for maps and oversized documents, 2 climate-controlled cabinets for the most fragile materials, a row of gray archive boxes on the lower shelves containing correspondence, photographs, and ephemera associated with various Caldwell faculty members over the decades. And in the far corner, a comfortable armchair in dark green velvet that was technically not supposed to be there, but that no one had ever asked her to remove. Rain had begun sometime in the night and was still falling now, softly and without urgency, against the tall casement windows. Miriam could hear it as she sliced through the tape on the box. A small, continuous percussion, like someone turning pages very quickly somewhere far away. Inside the box, wrapped loosely in acid-free tissue, she found what Daniel had promised: Victorian-era volumes, perhaps 20 of them, arrayed in no particular order. She lifted them out one by one and set them in a loose row along the examination table, reading their spines as she went. Tennyson in Memoriam, a collection of George Eliot's essays, cloth-bound, slightly worn at the corners. A first edition of Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White. She set that one carefully to one side, noting the condition of the spine with a small inward nod of approval. Several volumes of Thackeray, a copy of Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies in what appeared to be its original, ornate binding, a handsome set of Trollope in matching green cloth, 4 volumes, with Caldwell University Libraries, older-style book plates inside the front boards, which meant these had been library copies at some point, perhaps sold off in a deaccession decades ago, and then acquired by Professor Halsworth separately. She handled each book with the particular care that had long since become unconscious, cradling the spine, never bending the boards back past their natural angle, turning pages from the upper corner. It was the kind of attention that looked, to people who didn't know any better, like excessive caution, but was really just respect, the same instinct that makes you lower your voice in old buildings. The last book she drew from the box was smaller than the others, a slim octavo in plain green cloth, a little faded and somewhat scuffed at the head and tail of the spine. There was no title stamped on the spine at all, which was unusual. She turned it to look at the front board. Nothing there either. She opened it. The title page read, Common Wildflowers of the British Isles, a Field Companion by C. H. Bracewell, published by Chambers, Edinburgh, 1887. A modest book, the kind that had once been common in the collections of educated Victorian households, a practical nature guide of the sort that people carried on country walks and used to identify the plants in their hedgerows. Not a rare book, not especially valuable. She could find a dozen copies in any general antiquarian sale. She was about to set it at the end of the row with the others when she noticed something about the backboard. It was slightly proud of the text block, just a millimeter or two, barely perceptible, in a way that suggested the board had at some point been lifted away from the spine and re-adhered, or perhaps had simply swelled with moisture. and never quite returned to its original position. She set the book down, spine up, and looked more carefully. The back end paper, the paste down that lined the inside of the backboard, had a quality she could only describe, privately, as disturbed. Not damaged, not obviously tampered with, simply not entirely smooth in the way that an untouched end paper should be. Miriam retrieved her magnifying glass from its case on the shelf. A proper bibliographer's loupe, not a toy, and examined the edges of the paste down where it met the board. There, along the inner edge, where the paste down met the gutter, there was a very slight lifting, a separation of perhaps 2 millimeters, no more, the paper pulling away from the board in a way that could easily be attributed to age or fluctuating humidity. She reached for a bone folder, not to pry, never to pry, simply to investigate, and slid the thin, flat tip gently along the loosened edge. Something shifted inside. She paused, set down the bone folder, took a breath, not a dramatic breath, simply the kind one takes when one's attention has sharpened to a point. Then she tilted the book carefully and looked along the gap between the paste down and the board, angling it toward the window light. Paper, folded paper, pale yellow-white. Something was tucked between the end paper and the back board of this modest Victorian field guide, hidden in the small pocket of space that the slightly lifted paste down had created. Miriam put the book down on the table. She got up from her stool, went to her desk, and put on a pair of white cotton gloves, not because the book was valuable, but because something in the care with which this hidden thing had been placed made her feel that it deserved to be touched carefully. She returned to the examination table, and with considerable patience and the smallest possible movement of the bone folder, eased the folded paper out from its hiding place. It came free, with a sound like the softest breath. She set it on the examination table and looked at it for a moment before unfolding it. It was a single sheet of paper, folded 4 times into a compact square. The paper was cream-colored, good-quality writing paper of the kind people used to use for personal correspondence, not office stationery, not notebook paper, but paper bought for letters. It had yellowed to a warm ivory over time, but had not become brittle. It had been hidden in the dark, away from light and air, and had therefore survived rather well. On the outside of the folded paper, in small, neat handwriting, were 4 words: "For whoever finds this." Miriam looked at those 4 words for a long moment. The rain continued quietly against the window. Somewhere in the building, the old heating system made its habitual sound, a low, rolling clank that she had stopped hearing years ago, but registered now, for some reason, as a kind of punctuation. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting inside was the same as on the outside, small, careful, slightly compressed, the writing of someone who had been taught to form letters properly, and still took a certain quiet pride in doing so. A fountain pen, she thought, looking at the slight variation in line thickness. A fine nib. The ink was dark brown now, particular color that black ink becomes after several decades of slow oxidation. She read, 14 October 1984. If you are reading this, you have found what I hid. I am glad, though I will likely never know it. I have been thinking for some time about where to put this letter. Somewhere it would be kept, not thrown away, perhaps found someday by someone who would understand. A library book seemed right. Libraries keep things. They are among the last places that still believe in keeping things. I have not been able to speak these words aloud. I have tried. The occasions have presented themselves, and I have let them pass, because I am better at writing than speaking, and because I am afraid, and I am not entirely sure of what. His name is Thomas. He has been my colleague for 11 years, and my friend for most of those years, and I have thought for a long time, and I think I am certain now, that he is more than that, or could be, if I were not so careful, and he were not so quiet. I don't know if he knows. I think perhaps he suspects something. We have spoken around it, the way one speaks around things that seem too large for ordinary sentences. Last week, he brought me a book, this book, in fact, this wildflower guide, because we had walked on the hill above the college, and I had said I wished I knew the names of the flowers. He left it on my desk with no note. I thought, for a moment, that this was a message. I have been thinking about it since. Perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps I am writing a story around a book that was simply a kind gesture, but I wanted to say it somewhere, even in secret. I love him. I have loved him for, I think, 3 years, perhaps longer. And I don't know what to do with that, so I am putting it here, in this book he gave me, and hiding it away, and trusting the library to keep it safe. If you are a librarian, and I think you might be, please forgive the liberty I've taken with a library book. I will return it properly, I promise. I only needed to borrow it for a little while. Miriam finished reading. She sat quietly for a moment with the letter on the table in front of her, and the gray October rain against the window, and the scent of old paper in the air. Then she took off her gloves, picked up her tea, found it had gone cold, and went to put the kettle on. She made a fresh cup of tea and brought it back to the examination table. She read the letter again, more slowly this time, as though a second reading might yield something the first had not. And it did, in the way that second readings usually do. Not new information, exactly, but new texture. The careful formality of that opening sentence. The way the writer seemed to be speaking to an imagined future reader, trying to be understood across an interval of unknown length. The slight apology at the end. Please forgive the liberty. The date was the 14th of October 1984. Exactly 40 years ago, almost to the day. Miriam noted this without quite intending to, then found herself nodding that she had noted it, and thought about coincidence, and decided that coincidences were simply patterns you noticed out of all the patterns that were always occurring. October 14th, 1984. She would have been 13 years old. She would have been in her second year of secondary school in Shrewsbury. coming home from school on autumn afternoons to the smell of her mother's cooking and the particular amber light of October at 4 o'clock. She had no idea this letter existed. It had been sitting inside this book, inside some box or shelf somewhere, for every year of her adult life. The question was, of course, whose book was it? And where had Professor Houseworth come by it? She picked up the Wildflowers Field Guide and turned it over in her hands again. Inside the front board, there was no bookplate, which confirmed that whatever library it had belonged to before Professor Houseworth, it had not been catalogued with the usual Caldwell label. But wait. She opened the book again and looked at the front paste down more carefully. There was a bookplate, or rather, there was the ghost of one. A small rectangular ghost, slightly darker than the surrounding paper, the faint rectangular shadow left by an adhesive label that had at some point been removed. Someone had taken a bookplate off this book. That was not unusual in itself. Bookplates fell off, or were removed when books changed hands. But the shadow gave her something. She took out her magnifying glass again and studied the ghost rectangle carefully. Along the bottom of the shadow, so faint as to be nearly invisible without magnification, she could make out 2 or 3 printed words that the adhesive had preserved despite the plate's removal. The first word was incomplete. She could see only its last few letters. She angled the book toward the window. Well, University Library. Caldwell. This was a Caldwell University Library book, after all. It had been withdrawn from the collection at some point, deaccessioned, perhaps sold in one of the periodic sales the library held for duplicates and damaged stock, or perhaps simply lost and never recovered, and had found its way by some route to Professor Houseworth's shelves, which meant that in 1984, when R had borrowed it and hidden a letter inside it, this book had been a library book. R had taken it from the library, held it, tucked a letter inside it, and returned it. I will return it properly, I promise. She had kept that promise, and the letter had come back with the book into the library's collection, where it had waited in the stacks, presumably, for years before being deaccessioned. And then in Professor Houseworth's possession for 40 years. Miriam wrote a few notes on the yellow pad she kept on the examination table for this purpose. Green cloth, 8 vo. Bracewell, CH Common Wildflowers. Chambers, 1887. Former Caldwell Library, copy, bookplate removed, rectangular ghost remains. Letter found in backboard. October 14, 1984. Signed R. Addressed to unnamed male colleague, Thomas. She paused with her pen over the pad. Then she wrote, "Who was R?" The question felt quiet and steady, the way the right question usually did. The problem with 40 years, Miriam thought, was that it was long enough for people to have retired, moved away, changed, or died, but not so long that all traces would necessarily have vanished. 40 years was within living memory. Faculty records for 1984 would exist somewhere. There might be photographs. There would certainly be some people who remembered. She crossed to her desk and opened her computer. The university had, over the past decade, made considerable efforts to digitize its institutional records. Payroll archives, faculty lists, committee minutes, annual reports. And a good portion of this was now accessible through the library's own internal system. She navigated to the faculty records archive and entered the search field. She typed, Faculty Humanities, 1984. The system returned a scanned document. The 1980 41985 Caldwell University Faculty Handbook, a slim publication produced annually by the Registrar's Office, enlisting all academic and senior administrative staff by department. She clicked through to the relevant pages. The English and Comparative Literature Department for 1984-1985 listed 14 full-time academic staff, 3 research fellows, and 4 visiting lecturers. She read through the names. Thomas appeared twice. Dr. Thomas Beaumont, lecturer in Victorian literature, in post since 1975. And Dr. Thomas R. Archer, senior lecturer in Renaissance drama, in post since 1979. So there had been 2 Thomases in the English department in 1984. That was something to consider. She moved to the adjacent departments. History had a professor, Thomas Meredith, due to retire at the end of the 1980 41985 academic year. Modern languages had no Thomas at all. She went back to the English department listing and looked again, this time not for Thomases, but for staff members whose first names began with R. There was Dr. Rachel Pemberton, lecturer in 19th century literature, in post since 1981. There was Professor Robert Haynes, chair of the department, in post since 1968. And there was Dr. Rhys Owen, research fellow in Welsh and Anglophone writing, in post since 1982. R, that was a common enough initial. Rachel, Robert, Rhys, and she nearly missed it at the bottom of the list, in a separate section for senior administrative staff associated with the department. Dr. Ruth Calloway, departmental librarian and bibliographer, in post since 1973. Miriam sat back from her screen. A departmental librarian. If you are a librarian, and I think you might be, that phrase in the letter assumed a certain kinship, a shared understanding between the writer and whoever might find the letter. It was the kind of thing someone might write if they themselves knew something about libraries. She noted all 4 names on her yellow pad: Rachel Pemberton, Robert Haynes, Rhys Owen, Ruth Calloway. Then she drew a small asterisk next to Ruth Calloway's name and wrote beside it, departmental librarian. And then, after a moment, she added, in post since 1973. 11 years by 1984. The letter had said, he has been my colleague for 11 years. She put her pen down. Outside, the rain had eased slightly, the sound against the window gentling from a rattle to a murmur. The morning was getting on. It was nearly 10:30, and she was aware that she had a cataloging project due for review by the end of the week, and several emails that had been waiting since yesterday. She looked at the letter. She looked at her notes. She thought about a woman at a desk much like this one, 40 years ago, writing words she couldn't say aloud, and folding them into a book about wildflowers. The cataloging project could wait a day or two. It almost certainly could. The afternoon brought a dry spell between the rain showers, and Miriam used it to telephone the English department. She had worked at Caldwell long enough that calling another department felt natural. She knew the departmental administrator there, a brisk, helpful woman named Patricia, who had been in the job for as long as Miriam could remember, and who knew everything about the department's institutional history that was worth knowing. "Patricia," she said, when the phone was answered, "it's Miriam Ashby from Special Collections. I'm cataloging a donation from Professor Houseworth's estate, and I have a question about some of the volumes. Did he have any particular connection to the 1970s and 80s faculty? Was he around in that period?" "Oh, he was here from 1978, Patricia said promptly. "He retired in 2009. Old Edmund Houseworth, yes, he knew everyone from that era. He was in the department for 30 years. Lovely man. Very quiet, very kind. His daughter brought those books in, did she? That was good of her. He was quite devoted to the collection. Do you know," Miriam said carefully, "whether he had any close colleagues from that period? From the early 1980s, particularly?" A brief pause. "Well, he was friends with Thomas Beaumont. I know that they used to have lunch together every week until Thomas retired in the mid-90s. And I think he knew Ruth Calloway quite well. She was the departmental librarian for years. Wonderful woman. She retired in the early 2000s. Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to establish provenance for some of the volumes," Miriam said, which was accurate, if incomplete. "Thank you, Patricia. That's very helpful." She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended. Thomas Beaumont, lecturer in Victorian literature. Ruth Calloway, departmental librarian. 2 names and an old friendship, and a book about wildflowers that had come back to the library it started from. She opened the faculty handbook scan again and navigated to the photograph pages. The 1984 handbook had included small photographs of each faculty member, the sort that academic institutions had produced in those years. A head and shoulders shot, slightly formal, slightly impersonal, the product of a single afternoon with a university photographer in one of the common rooms. She found Thomas Beaumont's photograph. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair starting to silver at the temples, an open expression, something slightly tentative in his eyes, as though the photograph had caught him in the middle of thinking something over. He wore a corduroy jacket. He looked, Miriam thought, like someone who would leave a wildflower guide on a colleague's desk without a note, as a kind gesture, and not quite know that it might be read as something more. Ruth Calloway's photograph was on the next page. She was perhaps 35 in 1984. She'd been in post since 1973, so she would have started relatively young, fresh from library school or a first professional post. She had short, neat dark hair and the kind of composed expression that might have been shyness controlled into stillness. She was looking slightly to the side of the camera, not quite at it. She had, Miriam thought, the face of someone who was more comfortable observing than being observed. The letter's handwriting came back to her. Small, careful, slightly compressed, the writing of someone who had been taught to form letters properly. It was not proof of anything. It was a feeling. But Miriam's work had taught her to trust the feeling that a book gave you when you handled it. The sense that accumulated in your hands and your attention over years of paying close attention to things that most people overlooked. And the feeling she had now, looking at Ruth Calloway's composed, slightly averted face, was one of quiet recognition. She typed a note to herself. Locate Ruth Calloway, still living, retired where. The late afternoon brought the second box from Professor Houseworth's estate, delivered once again by Daniel, who this time also brought a small envelope. The professor's daughter came back, he said. She said she'd found this in her father's desk and thought it might be relevant. She wasn't sure. Inside the envelope was a card, a library card of the old style. The physical card that had once been kept inside the back pocket of a library book to record its loans. The card was for the item, Common Wildflowers of the British Isles, a Field Companion Bracewell, ch. 1887. There were perhaps 15 loan entries on the card, in various hands, recording the name of the borrower and the date. Miriam carried it to the window. Most of the entries were from the late 1960s and early 1970s. The book had evidently been popular once, before its subject matter became less relevant to the curriculum. There were entries for Blackmore, D. Haverstock, J. Ogilvy, M., all presumably students, borrowing a field guide for a countryside course. Then further down the card, a gap of several years. And then, in the slightly cramped, careful handwriting, she was already beginning to recognize R. Calloway. 2 October 1984, and below that, in the same hand, returned 15 October 1984. Miriam looked at the date of the letter. October 14th, 1984. Ruth Calloway had borrowed this book on the 2nd of October and returned it on the 15th. She had written the letter on the 14th, the day before she returned it. She had tucked the letter inside and brought the book back, just as she'd promised. R. Calloway. Miriam sat down in the green armchair in the corner of Special Collections, which was not really for sitting in during the working day, and held the library card in her cotton-gloved hand and thought about October 1984. About a woman in her mid-30s in a university library, not unlike this one, sitting at a desk, writing the truest thing she knew, and putting it somewhere safe where perhaps no one would ever read it, but where she could know it was kept. There was something in this that Miriam found unexpectedly moving, the particular form of quiet courage it represented. Not the courage of declarations, not the heroic kind, the other kind, the kind that said, "I cannot speak this, but I will not let it disappear entirely. I will give it to the keeping of a place that keeps things." She set the library card carefully beside the letter on the examination table and looked at them together. Then she went to make another cup of tea, because some things needed the small ritual of a cup of tea before you could continue thinking about them clearly. The next morning, Miriam arrived at the library at her usual time of 8:45, before the reading room opened. And while the building still had that particular quality of early morning silence, as though it were gathering itself before the day began. She had brought a thermos of coffee this time, as well as tea. She had a sense it might be a long day. She had spent part of the previous evening doing what anyone with her professional inclinations and a mystery on their hands would inevitably do: looking things up. The Caldwell University Library, as an institution, had kept reasonably thorough records of its own history. Staff records were in the university archives. Personnel files, naturally, were confidential. But the Human Resources Department kept an index of former staff that was accessible to current employees for the purpose of institutional research. It listed name, position, years of service, and sometimes a forwarding institution. She had searched for Ruth Calloway and found Dr. Ruth M. Calloway, departmental librarian and bibliographer, English and comparative literature. In post 1973-001. Retired 2001. No forwarding institution. No additional information. But the record indicated that Ruth Calloway had been at Caldwell for 28 years before retiring, which meant she would now be in her mid to late 70s if she were still alive. Thomas Beaumont's record read: Dr. Thomas J. Beaumont, lecturer, and subsequently senior lecturer in Victorian literature. In post 1970-51995. Left to take up post at University of Bristol. There was a year given 1995, and the University of Bristol, which was a thread. She had not followed that thread yet. She would do so today. But first, the archive room. The university archive was housed in the basement of the library's north wing, down a flight of stairs that smelled of cold stone and old paper, in a room that had been a coal cellar, until someone in the 1950s had had the good sense to convert it into a climate-controlled storage space. It was not a large room, but it was efficiently organized. Banks of gray metal shelving holding acid-free archive boxes in orderly rows, each labeled with a call number and a brief description of contents. Miriam had keys to the archive room as the head of special collections. She went down the stairs with her thermos and her yellow notepad, found the light switch, and stood for a moment in the cool, steady illumination while her eyes adjusted. The section she wanted was near the back. Departmental records, English and comparative literature, 1972-010. She had checked the index the previous afternoon and knew which boxes were likely to contain what she was looking for. She pulled 3 boxes from the shelves and carried them to the small table in the center of the room. The first box contained departmental meeting minutes from 1981-989. She put on her reading gloves and opened it. The minutes were typed on the kind of paper that yellows quickly, the particular cheap paper of institutional reproduction, kept in cardboard wallets labeled by year. She found 1984 and opened the wallet. She was not sure exactly what she was looking for, perhaps simply atmosphere, context, a sense of who these people were in their daily institutional lives. The minutes of departmental meetings were not, in her experience, the most illuminating documents in the world. They tended toward the administrative and the bureaucratic. But occasionally, if you read them carefully, you could feel the personalities behind the formal language, the tensions, the alliances, the places where the careful, neutral tone of the minutes was doing a great deal of quiet work. The October 1984 meeting had been held on Wednesday the 3rd, the day after Ruth Calloway had borrowed the Wildflower book. The agenda included items about curriculum review, library acquisitions, budget, graduate student supervision, and the upcoming publication of a departmental research bulletin. Under library acquisitions, the minutes recorded that Dr. Calloway reported on the quarter's acquisitions and noted several significant gaps in the Victorian and Edwardian holdings. Dr. Beaumont proposed a supplementary budget request to address specific lacunae in the nature writing collection. The proposal was seconded by Dr. Houseworth and approved in principle. Miriam read this twice. Dr. Calloway reporting on acquisitions. Dr. Beaumont proposing a supplementary budget for nature writing. A meeting that placed them both in the same room, working toward the same purpose. She moved forward through the minutes. November 1984. December. A retirement party for a Professor Williams, which both Calloway and Beaumont had apparently helped to organize. Their names appeared in a note at the end of the December minutes, thanking the subcommittee on social events, Dr. Calloway, Dr. Beaumont, Dr. Pemberton, for their efforts. She thought about them planning a party together. Choosing the food, perhaps. Arranging the room. The small negotiations of shared organizational work that put people in each other's orbit for hours at a time. The second box contained correspondence from the same period. She found a folder of letters from 1984-1985, mostly administrative, correspondence with publishers about examination copies, letters to visiting scholars about accommodation, a lengthy exchange with the university estate's office about a damp problem in the faculty building. And then, near the back of the folder, something different. A letter from Dr. Thomas Beaumont to the head of department, Professor Haynes. dated 22 November 1984. It was a short letter, carefully typed, and it concerned the departmental library's arrangement with the main university library for interlibrary loans. Dr. Beaumont wrote that he believed the current arrangement was creating unnecessary delays for students, and that Dr. Calloway has proposed a workable solution to this problem, which I understand she will be presenting at the next faculty meeting, and which I write to express my full support for in advance. He had written to support her proposal before it was even made, just to be on record. Miriam thought about that for a moment, about the quiet form of attention it represented, not a declaration, not a romantic gesture, but something. The kind of professional care that had a warmer feeling than mere collegiality. The kind of support that said, I notice your ideas. I think they are good. I want them to succeed. She was building a picture. It was made of small things, meeting minutes, a budget proposal, a supporting letter, a library card, a book left on a desk without a note. But small things had always told her more about people than large ones. After lunch, she ate at her desk, a sandwich from the cafe 2 streets away, which she had been doing every Tuesday and Thursday for approximately 15 years. Miriam decided to take a walk. The English and Comparative Literature department occupied the ground and first floors of a building that had been purpose-built in the late 1960s and had the slightly austere character of that era's architecture. Concrete panels, large square windows, a flat roof that collected water and caused periodic anxiety in the estates department. It was not a beautiful building, but Miriam had always thought it had a certain honest solidity. It knew what it was. She went not because she expected to find anything there exactly, but because she found that walking through spaces sometimes clarified thought in ways that sitting at a desk did not. She wanted to see the departmental library. The departmental library was a small room on the first floor, running the length of the building's east side. It had been Ruth Calloway's domain for 28 years. It was now managed by a junior librarian named Annika, who was shared between 3 departments and spent most of her time in the main building. The departmental library itself had shrunk considerably since the expansion of the university's digital resources. It now served mainly as a reference room for the department's faculty, supplemented by a small standing collection of print journals and reference works. Miriam pushed open the door. Annika was not there. The room was empty in the mid-afternoon. It was a quiet space, lined with dark wood shelves bearing the remains of what had once been a more substantial working collection. The ceiling was lower than in the main library, and the windows were wide, but faced north, giving the room a cool, even light that Miriam imagined would have been pleasant to work in. There was still a reference desk at the far end, a wide oak desk that looked considerably older than the building itself, probably rescued from an earlier faculty building, and brought here when this one was constructed. It had a surface polished smooth by decades of use, with the particular patina that oak develops under the consistent pressure of books and papers and hands. There was a lamp on it, switched off now, and a small card holder that read reference inquiries. Please see library catalog or contact main library special collections for rare materials. Miriam stood at the desk for a moment. She put her hands on the polished surface. This was where Ruth Calloway had worked for 28 years. This was the desk she had sat behind when she wrote departmental reports, processed acquisition requests, answered student queries about the holdings. This was, in all probability, the desk she had been sitting at on the 14th of October 1984, when she had written the letter, or perhaps at home, late in the evening, and had brought it in the next day and tucked it into the book before walking to the main library to return it. He left it on my desk with no note. This desk. Thomas Beaumont had walked to this room with a copy of a Wildflowers Field Guide, bought or borrowed. She wasn't sure yet, and left it on this desk without a note. She looked around the room. On the wall to her right, between two sets of shelves, there was a notice board that appeared to be the departmental library's informal repository for items that didn't quite have a proper home. Timetables, a list of extended loan procedures, a few postcards pinned without apparent system. And she noticed a series of small black and white photographs in simple wooden frames, each about 4 inches by 6 inches. Faculty portraits, she thought at first, stepping closer. But no, they were group photographs, the informal kind, taken at departmental events. She could see from the quality of the prints that some were quite old. She leaned forward to look at them more carefully. Third photograph from the left, a department Christmas party of some kind, to judge from the tinsel visible in one corner. Perhaps 20 people crowded into a room she recognized as the faculty common room. She couldn't read the year from the photograph itself, but the clothes and hairstyles suggested the early to mid 1980s. She scanned the faces, and there, near the right edge of the photograph, standing slightly apart from the main group, were 2 people in quiet conversation. A man in a corduroy jacket. She recognized the jacket before she recognized the face, because it was the jacket from the 1984 faculty handbook photograph. And a woman with short, dark hair who was looking not at the camera, but at something the man was saying. The woman was laughing, a genuine laugh, unguarded in the way that laughter at a party is when you've forgotten for a moment to be careful. Thomas Beaumont and Ruth Calloway at a Christmas party in what Miriam judged was probably 1983 or early 1984. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. She thought about the letter. He has been my colleague for 11 years and my friend for most of those years. Back in special collections that afternoon, Miriam turned to Thomas Beaumont. If the letter was Ruth's, and she was now quite certain that it was, then the second half of the story belonged to Thomas. She had established something of Ruth's feelings from the letter itself. But what of Thomas? What had he known, or suspected, or felt? His record showed he had left Caldwell in 1995, the year after Ruth had been at the university, to take up a post at the University of Bristol. She found the University of Bristol's online staff directory and searched for his name, not expecting to find him there after 30 years. He was not listed as current staff, but a search of the directory's emeritus section returned a brief entry. Professor Thomas J. Beaumont, emeritus professor of Victorian literature, joined Bristol 1995, retired 2010. So he had been at Bristol from 1995 to 2010, and had then presumably retired. If she had his approximate age from the 1984 photograph, perhaps 40 then, give or take, he would be in his late 70s now. Old, but not impossibly old. She tried an academic search engine next, looking for publications. Thomas Beaumont had published steadily throughout his career. Articles in Victorian literature quarterly, a monograph on Tennyson in 1989, a book on the pastoral tradition in late Victorian poetry in 1998. His most recent publication in the database was from 2008, 2 years before his retirement. She tried an obituary search as a precaution. Nothing came up. She tried a general web search. Among the results was a link to a literary society newsletter, the Victorian Literature Society, a small professional organization for scholars of the period. The newsletter was from 2019 and included a brief item. Professor Thomas Beaumont, long-standing member of the society and contributor to our annual symposium, has moved to Shropshire, where he is reportedly enjoying retirement, gardening, and revisiting the nature poetry of his scholarly career. A small photograph accompanied the item. A man in his mid to late 70s, gray-haired, with the same slightly tentative quality she had noticed in his 1984 photograph. He had aged well, she thought. He still had the look of someone in the middle of a thought. Shropshire, that was not so far. Shropshire was 2 hours by train. She noted this, not entirely sure what she intended to do with the information. She also noted nature poetry. He had gone back to it in retirement, had kept the interest alive all these years. She thought of the wildflower guide left on a desk without a note, and the budget proposal for the nature writing collection in the departmental meeting minutes. A man who cared about the natural world, who had wanted the library to have better books about it, who had thought to give one to someone he was fond of. She was becoming very sure of Thomas Beaumont, she realized. She had a strong sense of the sort of person he was, assembled from fragments spread over 40 years. The way you build a sense of a person from the small things they leave in the world without particularly meaning to. The question now was Ruth. Where was Ruth? Staff records gave her nothing beyond what she already had. Retired 2001. No forwarding institution. She tried the same searches she had tried for Thomas: academic databases, society newsletters, obituaries. Ruth Calloway had published relatively little, a few bibliographic articles in specialist journals in the 1980s and 1990s, a chapter in an edited volume on women in academic librarianship in 1997. Nothing after 2001, which was not unusual. Many librarians didn't have public-facing academic profiles in the way that faculty did. She tried the alumni and former staff network. Caldwell had a modest but functional one, and found a brief entry for Ruth Calloway, which included an email address that, when she cautiously sent a message to it, bounced back as inactive. The address had probably been set up years ago and never maintained. She tried something different. The 1997 edited volume. She had the title from the database entry, Women in the Academic Library, Professional Lives and Institutional Memory, edited by Dr. Susan Pierce, published by Library Association Publishing. It was the kind of specialized professional book that was unlikely to be in the main stacks, but was almost certain to be in her own collection. She went to the relevant section of special collections shelving, and after a few minutes searching, found it. A slim cloth-bound volume with a plain dust jacket, acquired as part of a broader donation about professional library history some years ago. She found Ruth Calloway's chapter, Departmental Libraries as Memory Spaces, a personal account, and read it. It was a thoughtful piece about the role of the departmental library as a kind of institutional memory, a space that held not just books, but the accumulated intellectual life of a community. She wrote about her own work at Caldwell with evident affection, describing the process of building a collection that served both students and faculty. The pleasure of knowing readers needs well enough to anticipate them. The satisfaction of a well-organized and well-used library. She wrote, "The best departmental library is one in which the librarian becomes, over time, nearly invisible, the collection so responsive, and the systems so transparent that users can find what they need without consciously thinking about the work that has made it available to them. I have spent 20 years trying to become invisible. I think I may be making progress." Miriam read this and felt again that particular movement inside her chest that she associated with recognizing someone. The sense that she was seeing, in these careful professional sentences, the same person who had written the letter. The same thoughtful attention, the same slight, self-deprecating humor, the same instinct for tending quietly to things. At the end of the chapter, in the author biography section, was a note. Ruth M. Calloway has been departmental librarian and bibliographer at the University of Caldwell since 1973. She lives in Shropshire. Miriam stopped reading. Shropshire. She read it again. She lives in Shropshire. The book had been published in 1997, which meant she had been living in Shropshire at least as early as 1997, while still working at Caldwell, presumably. And Thomas Beaumont had moved to Shropshire after his 2010 retirement. She sat very still with the book in her hands. This could mean nothing. Shropshire was a large county. Many people lived there. It was entirely possible that Ruth Calloway had bought a cottage in the Shropshire Hills in the 1990s, and Thomas Beaumont had retired there a decade later by pure coincidence. It was also possible that it was not a coincidence at all. She needed more information. There was a professional network she had been part of for years, a mailing list, and occasional meetings of librarians in rare books, and special collections from universities in the Midlands and West Country. It was an informal group, the kind of professional community that sustained itself by mutual interest and occasional shared meals at conferences. She knew people on this list who had worked at universities across the region, who had professional histories reaching back into the 1980s and before. She composed a careful email. She said she was researching the provenance of a donated volume with a connection to a former member of Caldwell staff, and that she was trying to locate Dr. Ruth Calloway or any information about her professional life post 2001. She framed it as an archival and bibliographic inquiry, which was accurate. She sent the email at 4 in the afternoon and did not expect a response until the following day. But by 4:30, her inbox had a reply from Dr. Francis Whitby, the rare books librarian at a small university college in Herefordshire, whom Miriam had met at a conference in Birmingham 3 years ago, and had found to be a person of considerable knowledge and almost limitless professional gossip. Ruth Calloway. Yes, I know the name. We overlapped at a Library Association symposium in 1999. Lovely woman, very knowledgeable about Victorian bibliographic history. I believe she retired to a village in Shropshire, somewhere near Ludlow, when she left Caldwell. I have a vague memory that she was still involved with the Friends of Ludlow Library into the 2010s. Your best bet might be to contact them directly. I'll copy in Claire Ambrose at Ludlow Library, who might be able to help. Hope the provenance research goes well. These little mysteries are the best part of the job. Miriam read this email in its entirety and found herself smiling in the particular way she did when a research trail, which had seemed to be thinning, suddenly thickened again. She wrote to Claire Ambrose at Ludlow Library. The reply came the following morning, while she was still at home with her first cup of tea. Claire Ambrose confirmed that yes, Ruth Calloway had been an active member of the Friends of Ludlow Library until about 2018, when she had stepped back from volunteer activities for health reasons. She was, as far as Claire knew, still living in the area, a village called Ashford Carbonell, just south of Ludlow. And while Claire could not provide a personal address, she offered to pass a message along if Miriam wished to write one that Claire could forward. Miriam replied to Claire Ambrose that she would very much appreciate this, and that she would prepare a brief letter. She sat at her kitchen table for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the morning light coming through the window, thinking about what to write. How to explain this in a letter that would be passed to a stranger in a way that was honest and careful and did not feel like an intrusion. She thought about the letter on the examination table back at the library. For whoever finds this, she was whoever. That, she thought, was perhaps where she should begin, while she waited to hear whether Ruth Calloway would respond to her letter. Miriam returned to the second box of Professor Halsworth's donation, which she had not yet opened. She had been somewhat distracted by the first box, which was understandable. She lifted the flaps and found, as with the first box, a collection of books wrapped in tissue paper, along with several looser items, a bundle of academic correspondence, a few issues of a Victorian studies journal from the late 1980s, and at the very bottom of the box, a small hardcover notebook with a brown leatherette cover. She took the notebook out and looked at it. On the inside cover, in neat handwriting, was written, T.J. Beaumont, Personal Notes, Autumn 1984. She stared at this for a moment. Then she set the notebook carefully on the examination table, put on her gloves, and opened it. It was not a diary in any full sense. There were no daily entries, no narrative of events. It was more like a working notebook. Lists of references, reading notes, drafts of seminar questions, occasional fragments of thought that he had evidently wanted to capture and return to. The handwriting was small and quite distinctive, slightly angular, the hand of someone who thought quickly and wrote to keep up with the thinking. She turned the pages carefully. Most of it was professional notes on Tennyson, a draft outline for a paper on Victorian nature poetry, a list of secondary sources he wanted to track down. She read through it with care, not knowing exactly what she was looking for. She found it on the 15th page. There was a brief entry, undated, but positioned by the surrounding material in mid to late October 1984. It was written in a slightly different pen, or perhaps with more pressure. The lines were darker, as though he had pressed harder as he wrote. Don't know what to do about R. Have been thinking about the book, whether it was too much, or not enough, or simply the wrong thing entirely. She said nothing. Perhaps it was obvious. Perhaps it wasn't obvious at all. I am not good at knowing the difference between what I think and what other people can see. I could simply ask her whether she would like to have dinner sometime. A sentence of 12 words. I have rehearsed it approximately 40 times, and I have not said it. Why am I writing this in a notebook instead of just saying it? Because I am more certain of what I want to say when I write it down. Because I am afraid of the alternative. Because she has been my friend for 3 years, and I value that above almost everything in my professional life, and I am afraid that saying something will damage it. I think she knows. I don't think I am imagining it, but I have been wrong about this kind of thing before. Miriam read this passage very slowly. She read it again. She looked at the letter, lying on the other side of the examination table. She looked at the notebook. She thought, these two people, in October 1984, both afraid of 12 words, writing to pieces of paper instead of to each other. She thought of the Christmas party photograph on the notice board in the departmental library. Ruth laughing at something Thomas had said. Thomas caught in 3/4 profile, his face open and attentive. She thought, did you ever say it? The next morning, she called Professor Houseworth's daughter. Her name was Claire, not the Claire from Ludlow Library, a different Claire. And she had an email address on record in the donation paperwork. Miriam explained carefully that she was cataloging her father's books and had found some items that she had questions about, and asked whether Claire would be willing to speak with her. Claire agreed readily. She was, Miriam thought, still in the phase that follows a bereavement, where you welcome any opportunity to talk about the person you have lost. They spoke for nearly an hour. Claire Houseworth was in her 50s, a solicitor in Birmingham, and had inherited her father's thoughtful, measured way of speaking. She described Edmund Houseworth as a gentle man, deeply private, with a capacity for loyalty to his friends and colleagues that she had found touching and occasionally frustrating in equal measure. He kept in touch with people forever, she said. He was still writing letters, actual paper letters, to retired colleagues in the year before he died. He never quite accepted email as the proper way to do it. Did he ever mention Ruth Calloway? Miriam asked. A pause. Yes, he did, actually. She was one of the people he corresponded with. I found letters from her in his desk. Or rather, I found his copies of letters to her, and a few from her as well. After he died, I wasn't sure whether to send them back to her or keep them or what. I think I put them aside without deciding. And Thomas Beaumont. Another pause, this one slightly longer. He mentioned Thomas quite often, yes. They were close friends. You know, Tom was the one who retired to Shropshire first, and Edmund used to go and stay with him for a week every summer. She paused. May I ask why you're asking about Tom and Ruth specifically? Miriam considered how much to say. She decided on the truth. She explained briefly and carefully what she had found. The letter in the book, the library card, the notebook. There was a silence on the line. Then Claire Houseworth said, in a somewhat different tone, "Oh, I'm sorry," Miriam said. "I don't want to intrude into anything that should remain private." "No," Claire said. "No, I'm just surprised because they did get together eventually. Tom and Ruth, they've been together since, I think, the mid-90s. My father never quite said so explicitly, but I gathered from things he let slip over the years that they had been circling around each other for a very long time, and that it was only when Tom left Caldwell that they finally, she stopped. I didn't know the full story. I didn't know there had been a letter." Miriam sat with this for a moment. A warmth had spread through the afternoon, something that made the gray October light outside her window seem kinder than it had a moment before. "They're still in Ashford Carbonell," Claire added. "Both of them, Tom and Ruth. They moved in together after they both retired. They share a house near Ludlow." She paused. I think my father's books went to the library because Ruth would have wanted them to. That was his way of doing things for people without making a fuss about it. That evening, Miriam stayed late in special collections. This was not unusual. She often stayed after the library officially closed, enjoying the particular quality of the building after the readers and staff had gone. The way it held its own silence, the way a library holds its books, carefully, deliberately, with attention. She sat in the green velvet armchair. It was entirely for sitting in after hours. She told herself, with the desk lamp casting a circle of amber light over the examination table. And she reread both the letter and the relevant passages from the notebook. She had assembled by now a fairly complete picture of what had happened in the autumn and winter of 1984. Two people, colleagues and friends for 3 years, who had arrived separately and quietly at something they were afraid to name, and had chosen, each in their own way, to write it down rather than to speak it. Ruth to a letter hidden in a library book. Thomas to a working notebook. They had been afraid of the same thing, that nomming it would damage what they already had. A professional friendship that had evidently been the most important relationship in each of their working lives. The kind of friendship that sustains you through long institutional days, that makes the ordinary meaningful, that turns a budget meeting and a departmental party and a Tuesday afternoon walk up a hill into something worth remembering. They had been afraid, and for a while, she didn't know how long, but several years at least, they had continued being afraid, saying nothing, letting the friendship hold its form while something warmer moved beneath its surface. And then Thomas had left Caldwell, 1995. And perhaps the distance, the absence of the daily proximity that had felt so necessary to protect, had made the conversation possible. Perhaps the risk had shifted, or perhaps one of them had simply decided that the weight of not saying it had become heavier than the weight of the alternative. She thought about this for a while, in the lamplight, with the old building quiet around her. She thought about the 40 years the letter had waited, about the book it had been hidden in, the modest little wildflower guide, the one he had chosen as a gift, thinking of her saying she wished she knew the names of the flowers. Eyebright and meadow cranesbill and oxeye daisy, and the hundreds of ordinary wild things growing in the hedgerows and on the hillsides. He had wanted her to know their names, and she had hidden a letter in the very book he had given her, hidden it there and returned it to the library, and trusted the library to keep it, which the library had. For 40 years, she picked up the letter and read the last paragraph once more. If you are a librarian, and I think you might be, please forgive the liberty I've taken with a library book. I will return it properly, I promise. I only needed to borrow it for a little while. Miriam looked at the letter for a long moment in the lamplight. Something about the last sentence did something to her breathing. She had, over the course of the week, thought about it in purely textual terms, the book, the letter, the return. But it occurred to her now that the sentence had another meaning. Not only the book borrowed for a little while, the feeling too. The feeling she had borrowed and brought back carefully because she couldn't keep it, or didn't know how to, or was afraid. But things borrowed and returned sometimes come back to you. The radiator clanked its habitual evening clank. Outside, the October rain had started again, soft and steady against the tall windows. Miriam folded the letter very gently back into its 4 careful folds and held it in her gloved hands. The following day, Claire Ambrose from Ludlow Library replied to Miriam's letter. She had forwarded it, as promised, to Ruth Calloway, and Ruth had replied. Claire attached Ruth's response to her email. The attachment was a scanned letter, handwritten in blue ink. The handwriting was the same as the letter on Miriam's examination table, slightly compressed, careful, unmistakably the same hand, though the years had given it a slight tremor that the 1984 letter did not have. Dear Dr. Ashby, thank you for your kind letter, forwarded to me by Claire at Ludlow Library. I hope you will forgive my cautious approach to correspondence with people I do not know. At my age, one becomes somewhat protective of one's time and quiet. I must say that your letter gave me quite a turn. I had not thought about that book in many years, and I will admit that I had more or less succeeded in forgetting that the letter existed. When I was young, hiding it seemed like a sensible middle course between saying something I was afraid to say and letting the feeling disappear entirely. I'm not sure, 40 years later, whether it was sensible or merely cowardly. You ask whether I would be willing to speak with you about it. I find, rather to my surprise, that I would. Not because it is a remarkable story, particularly. I suspect rather more than one quietly unrequited feeling has been hidden in library books over the years. But because I am curious about you, a librarian who found a letter and went to the trouble of finding the person who wrote it, I should tell you, in the spirit of full disclosure, that Thomas is here. We have been together since 1997, which means the letter was hidden for about 13 years before that. And then another 27 years after. So it has waited 40 years in total, which strikes me as quite patient for a piece of paper. If you would like to visit, we would be glad to have you. We live in a small house near Ludlow, and we have a garden that Tom is very proud of, and I still make very good shortbread. Come when you like. With warm regards, Ruth Calloway. Miriam read this letter twice, in much the same way she had read the first one, the first time quickly, for the meaning, and the second time slowly, for the texture. She noted, together since 1997, not the mid-90s, as Claire Halsworth had vaguely remembered, but 1997, 13 years after the letter. She thought about 13 years of continuing to be careful, and then not being careful anymore. She thought about what had changed. She would ask if she visited, and if it seemed the right kind of question. She thought about the letter and the notebook, side by side on the examination table. Two people in the same month in the same autumn, writing what they couldn't say, and then going on with their careful lives for 13 more years before one of them finally said the 12 words, "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" She found she was very much looking forward to meeting them. She went on a Saturday in early November, which felt like the right kind of day, the particular quality of early November light, that clear, bright, pale gold that comes after the leaves have fallen and the sky settles into its winter blue, was, she thought, good weather for something that had waited 40 years and could finally come out into the open. She took the train from the university town to Ludlow, a journey of about an hour and 40 minutes through countryside that began flat, and then, as it progressed westward, started to become something more interesting. Low hills appearing on the horizon, small valleys opening, the quality of the light changing as the land gathered itself. She had the letter with her in an acid-free folder inside her bag. She had thought carefully about whether to bring it and had decided yes. It belonged, she had begun to feel, to its author, despite the 40 years of institutional custody. The library copy of the Wildflower Guide she had left at Caldwell. It was a library book and should remain in the library. But the letter was something different. She would offer it to Ruth. If Ruth wanted to keep it, she should keep it. If she wanted to give it to Thomas, or to burn it, or to fold it back into the book, that should also be her choice. She watched the countryside from the train window, thinking about provenance. Provenance was the word bibliographers used for the history of a book's ownership, who had held it, in what order, and how it had moved through the world. Every hand that had touched it, every shelf it had rested on, every transaction of purchase or gift or bequest that had passed it from one person to another. A good provenance trail was one of the most satisfying things in rare books' work. The sense of a continuous thread, unbroken, connecting the present reader to all the readers who had come before. The letter had a provenance too. Ruth had written it in 1984 and hidden it in the book she'd borrowed from the library. The library had taken the book back and shelved it, not knowing what it held. At some point, she didn't know exactly when the book had been deaccessioned, sold perhaps in one of the library's periodic sales, and had come into Professor Halsworth's possession. He had kept it for years, kept it through his retirement, and at his death, his daughter had sent his books back to the library where the letter had begun. And Miriam had found it, a loop completed, a circle drawn over 40 years. She thought about what kind of person Professor Halsworth had been. Claire had described him as loyal, private, devoted to his friends. He had corresponded with Ruth by paper letter until the end of his life. He had visited Thomas in Shropshire every summer. He had, Miriam thought, known about the letter, or had suspected something, had known about the book, had kept it all this time for his own reasons, perhaps simply because it had been in the donation. And he didn't have the heart to send it back sooner, or perhaps because he understood that some things need the full weight of time before they can be received. Or perhaps it was simply chance. The history of books was full of chance. She got off the train at Ludlow Station, which was a small and pleasant station with flower boxes on the platform, and walked down into the town, which was the kind of market town she had always liked. A medieval market square with a covered market hall, streets of timber-framed buildings in black and white, a castle on a hill overlooking everything. She had not been to Ludlow before, though she had always meant to come. She collected her hired bicycle from the station. She had arranged this in advance. It seemed more appropriate than a taxi, and set off along the road south toward Ashford Carbonell. The house was a stone cottage at the edge of the village, set back from the lane behind a garden wall over which the last of the season's climbing roses were clinging, their hips gone red and glossy. There was a gate, a path through the garden, and a front door that had been painted the particular deep blue that Miriam associated with houses owned by people who thought carefully about colors. A man opened the gate before she reached it. He was tall, white-haired, dressed in a dark green jumper and old corduroy trousers, and he had that same quality she had noticed in his photographs across 40 years. Something in the expression that suggested he was in the middle of a thought and was willing to be interrupted. "Dr. Ashby," he said, with a warmth that surprised her slightly, as though they were resuming an acquaintance that had been pleasant the first time. "I'm Thomas. Ruth is inside, putting the kettle on. I've been watching for you from the garden." He had been watching for her. She thought about the notebook entry. "I think she knows. I don't think I am imagining it." He had, 40 years later, the same quality of careful attention. Some things did not change. "It's beautiful," Miriam said, gesturing at the garden. It was, even in November. The bones of it were clear and graceful, the paths well kept, the structure of the beds visible beneath the dying back of the season's growth. Rosemary and lavender, and the silver seed heads of many things she couldn't immediately name, but that she now wished she could. "It takes up most of my time, which is what it's for," Thomas said. He had a dry, quiet way of speaking that she liked immediately. "Come in. Ruth has been looking forward to this." The inside of the house had the particular character of homes occupied by people who have brought together two large personal libraries and had to negotiate the result. Books were everywhere in proper fitted shelves along most of the walls, but also in secondary arrangements on side tables and window ledges, and the floor beside the sofa, in the comfortable layered way of houses where reading is a serious occupation. She felt immediately, entirely at home. Ruth Calloway was in the kitchen, and when she came out to the sitting room, Miriam recognized her immediately from the 1984 photograph. The same composed quality, the same slight tendency to look a little to the side of what she was looking at, as though she were more comfortable with peripheral vision than direct. She was in her mid to late 70s now, her hair white and cut short as it had been 40 years ago, and she moved with the deliberate care of someone who had perhaps dealt with some health difficulties in recent years. She was carrying a tray with a teapot and cups and a plate of shortbread, and she looked at Miriam over the top of her glasses with an expression that was both cautious and curious. "Dr. Ashby," she said, "thank you for coming such a long way." "Thank you for having me," Miriam said. "And please, Miriam." They settled in the sitting room. Ruth in a deep chair by the window, Thomas on the sofa beside Miriam, the tray of tea between them. Outside, through the window, the November garden and the fields beyond it, pale gold and gray blue under the clear afternoon sky. They talked for a long time. Miriam told them how she had found the letter, the box of Professor Halsworth's donation, the modest green cloth-bound book, the slightly proud backboard, the 4 words on the outside of the folded paper. She described the library card, Ruth's name in the familiar handwriting, the dates. She described finding the notebook in the second box. Edmund had the notebook, Thomas said. He looked genuinely surprised. "I hadn't thought about that. I must have given it to him at some point. I lent him things sometimes and forgot." He looked at Ruth. "I didn't know he'd kept it." "He kept everything," Ruth said. She was holding the letter now, unfolded in her lap. Miriam had given it to her as soon as they sat down, had simply taken it from the acid-free folder and held it out. And Ruth had taken it without hesitation and read it with a stillness that suggested she was reading it several times over. That was very like Edmund. "The 2 of you corresponded until he died," Miriam said. "Until the end, yes," Ruth said. "He was a faithful letter writer. He wrote to us separately, and then jointly after we moved in together every month or 2. Long letters, full of observations about things he'd read or seen or thought about. He was very good company on paper." She paused. "I think he knew about the letter, or something like it. He never mentioned it directly, but he sent me a postcard once. This must have been in the late 90s, with just a line from Tennyson on it. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all,' which is a terribly obvious thing to quote, of course. But Edmund was never obvious about anything, so I thought he might be saying something more specific." She looked up from the letter. "I think he may have found the letter at some point and decided not to say anything about it, and then sent you Tennyson," Thomas said. "And then sent me Tennyson." They were quiet for a moment. The November light came through the window. The shortbread was very good, and the tea was strong and warm. "May I ask," Miriam said carefully, "how it eventually," she gestured slightly, not sure how to end the sentence. Ruth and Thomas looked at each other with the brief, private look that long-established couples exchange when a question is familiar. The look that means, "Shall I tell it, or will you? I resigned from Caldwell in the autumn of 1994, Thomas said. I'd been offered the Bristol post, and I'd accepted it. And I was finishing up the year and handing over my teaching to a colleague. And I decided, this is perhaps very cowardly, but I decided that I could say it because I was leaving. That the worst possible outcome that that she would feel awkward around me, that it would damage things between us, would be mitigated by the fact that we would no longer be in the same building every day. He paused. He looked for a moment like the man in the corduroy jacket in the 1984 photograph. The slight hesitance, the quality of thought. I asked her if she would like to have dinner, he said. In February 1995, about 3 weeks before I left. I had rehearsed it approximately 40 times over the previous 11 years. Miriam thought of the notebook. I have rehearsed it approximately 40 times, and I have not said it. What did you say? She asked. I said, would you like to have dinner on Friday? He said. Just that. It took about 2 seconds. 3 years to build up to it, Ruth said dryly. 2 seconds to actually say. She said yes, Thomas said to Miriam, in a tone that still, 30 years later, carried something she could only describe as amazed. I said yes, Ruth confirmed. She was looking at the letter in her lap again, with an expression that Miriam found difficult to categorize. Something between rueful and tender. The expression of someone visiting a younger version of themselves with affection and the particular patience of hindsight. I had been waiting for a very long time. I could hardly say no. We had dinner, Thomas said, and then I went to Bristol. We wrote letters for 2 years, proper letters, which Ruth was very good at, and which I attempted. And then in 1997, Ruth retired, and he paused. He asked me to come to Bristol, Ruth said simply. I didn't want to. I had my house here, and I liked it. So he came here instead. A small pause. That's it, really. We've been here ever since. That's it, really. 40 years of quietly wanting, and 2 years of letters, and then one person moving to where the other person was. The plainest possible accounting of a love story. After tea, Thomas took her to see the garden. It was getting late in the afternoon, the light thinning toward early evening, but there was still enough of it to see clearly. He walked her along the paths, telling her the names of things, the plants, the trees at the far end, the rose varieties trained along the south-facing wall. He knew all their names, every single one. She thought of the wildflower guide, the one he had left on Ruth's desk. I had said I wished I knew the names of the flowers. She had learned them, evidently, or he had taught her. The distinction, she thought, didn't matter. Ruth showed me the photograph, Miriam said, as they reached the far end of the garden, where a low stone wall looked out over the fields. From the Christmas party, the one where she's laughing. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I don't remember what I said, he said. That made her laugh. I've thought about it occasionally over the years, and I genuinely can't recall. Something about the tinsel, perhaps. She wasn't looking at the camera, Miriam said. She was looking at you. He turned to look at the fields for a moment, the way people do when something reaches them, and they need a moment to absorb it. The last of the November light was very gentle, lying pale and gold across the brown fields. You know, he said eventually, I found the book once, wildflower book. After Ruth moved here, we were organizing the shelves, combining our collections, and I came across it. I knew it was from the library. I'd given it to her, after all, and she'd kept it. I found that quite moving, that she'd kept it. I didn't look inside. I didn't know there was anything inside. She returned it, Miriam said. Before she kept it, she returned it, with the letter inside. He was quiet again for a little while. She returned it, he said, as though he were checking the sentence, making sure he understood it. Yes, Miriam said. And then you deaccessioned it at some point, and Professor Houseworth bought it, or acquired it somehow, and he kept it for years. And then his daughter sent it back to the library with the rest of his books, and I found it. Full circle, Thomas said. Full circle, Miriam agreed. They stood for a moment, looking at the fields, and the fatting light, and the rose hips on the wall, red in the gray November afternoon. She was always very good, he said, at trusting things to be kept. Better than I was. I would have worried. She put it in the library and trusted the library. Libraries are good at keeping things, Miriam said. She thought of the letter. Libraries keep things. They are among the last places that still believe in keeping things. Yes, Thomas said. He smiled slightly. Yes, they are. When they came back inside from the garden, Ruth was at the writing table in the corner of the sitting room, a pen in her hand, looking at the letter that was spread open before her. She looked up when they came in. I want to ask you something, she said to Miriam. Of course, Miriam said. What are you going to do with it, the letter and the book? Miriam had thought about this, but she found she wanted to hear what Ruth thought before she said her own piece. What would you like me to do with it? Ruth looked at the letter for a moment. The book should stay in the library, she said. I told it I would return it properly, and I did, and it has been properly returned. It belongs to the collection. She paused. But the letter, I'm not sure the letter was ever really the library's. I hid it in a library book, but that was just a container, a safe-keeping place. I don't think I intended it to become library property. I intended it to be found. By whoever found it, Miriam said. By whoever found it, Ruth agreed. She looked at Miriam. You have been very careful with it, she said. I can tell from the way you handle it and the way you talk about it. You've treated it like something worth being careful with. It is, Miriam said. I think Ruth glanced at Thomas, who was sitting in the chair across the room, watching this exchange with attention. I think I would like you to keep a record of it. Not the letter itself, that I would like back, if you're willing, because I think I want to keep it now, which I didn't when I was 35 and hiding it from myself. But the story of how you found it, the library card, the notebook, all of it, I think that might be worth keeping. Somewhere in the library. Oral history, Miriam said. Or written. You could write it up, couldn't you? The provenance of a letter. The trail of a 40-year-old secret. Ruth's eyes had a quality that Miriam had not quite seen in them before, something lighter, almost amused. I suspect you are quite good at that sort of thing. I'll try, Miriam said. She took the train back in the early evening. The countryside outside the window was dark by now. The November night settled in, and she could see the lights of scattered farmhouses and the occasional brighter cluster of a village going past. She had her notebook on her knee and was writing in it, not formal notes, just impressions, the kind of record that came before the official account. She wrote down the names of the plants Thomas had told her in the garden: Verbena bonariensis, clematis, Japanese anemone, the late flowering rose called emime, Alfred Carriere, that covered the south wall and wood, he said, bloom into November some years if it was feeling optimistic. She wrote down the way the November light had looked across the fields from the garden wall, and Ruth's face when she read the letter, and the expression on Thomas's face when she told him that Ruth had returned the book. She wrote down what Ruth had said. Libraries keep things. They are among the last places that still believe in keeping things. She thought about this on the train, in the dark, with the lights of the countryside moving past. She had spent her working life in a library, and in some important ways, the library had held parts of her own life for safekeeping as well. The books she had read that had changed how she thought, the scholarly problems that had occupied her for years and left their marks in annotation and note card, the professional friendships sustained across decades of correspondence about bibliographic questions and provenance puzzles, and the small mysteries of book history. She had put her attention and her care into the keeping of things, trusting that the things she kept would remain available to their original owners, to future researchers, to whoever found them. For whoever finds this, she found she was glad she had been that whoever. She was glad she had gone to the trouble of following the trail, and that the trail had led here to a stone house near Ludlow, and a careful garden, and two people in their late 70s who had found their way to each other after a very long and quiet road, and who still had, between them, something warm and steady and entirely their own. She felt, riding home through the November dark, the satisfaction that came with the completion of a provenance trail, the sense of a thread followed to its source, of a thing put in its right place, of a puzzle resolved not dramatically, but gently, as the best puzzles were. Back at Caldwell, Miriam wrote it up. She cataloged the Wildflower Guide in the usual way: author, title, publisher, date, condition, provenance, and noted in the provenance field, former Caldwell University library copy, deaccessioned at unknown date, subsequently in the collection of Professor Edmund Houseworth. Caldwell, English, 1970, 82009. Donated to Special Collections, 2024. She noted the letter's discovery in a separate descriptive note and attached a scanned copy of the library card. The letter itself she returned to Ruth by registered post, wrapped in acid-free tissue inside a sturdy padded envelope. With it, she included a brief note. Dear Ruth, I am returning the letter as promised. It has been very well cared for these 40 years. Libraries, as you know, are good at that. It will continue to be, I think, if that is what you want for it. But I believe you were right that it belongs with you now. The record I am keeping is a small one, a provenance note in the catalog, and a longer account written for the Special Collections Archive, which will sit with the other institutional records from that period. Your name and Thomas's will appear there, with your permission, as part of the documented history of the collection. I have tried to treat the story with the care you treated the letter with, as something worth giving to safekeeping, to be found when the time is right. With warm regards, Miriam Ashby, Head of Special Collections, Caldwell University Library. She sealed the envelope and took it to the post office herself during her lunch break on a Tuesday, which was the best kind of day for sending things off. The days continued. The term moved toward its end. The cataloging project was completed rather later than originally intended, and the review went well. The horse chestnut outside the library's east window finished losing its leaves and stood bare and clean against the winter sky. Miriam returned to the regular rhythms of her work. Acquisitions, assessments, inquiries from researchers about this collection or that archive. The quiet pleasures of handling books that had been handled for a century or two already, and were none the worse for it. She gave a seminar to the first-year library science students about the ethics of archival discovery. What to do when you find something that wasn't meant for you, or wasn't meant for anyone in particular, or was meant for the future, without knowing what shape the future would take. She included in this seminar a brief case study. She changed no names. She had Ruth and Thomas's permission, and she described the discovery carefully and fully. The box of donated books, the slightly proud backboard, the 4 words on the outside of the folded paper. She described the library card, the faculty handbook, the archive room, the notebook, the Victorian Literature Society newsletter, the email from Frances Whitby, the letter from Claire at Ludlow, and eventually the train to Shropshire, and the garden in November, and the shortbread, and the long afternoon of conversation. She described what she had done with the letter when she found it. She described what she had done with the story when she understood it. She said, "The question in archival discovery is always this: whose is it now? Something was made by one person, held by another, preserved by an institution, and found by you. All of those people have a claim on it of varying kinds. The original maker has a claim of creation and intent. The institution has a claim of custody. You have a claim, perhaps the most interesting kind of discovery. You found it because you were paying attention. But paying attention does not mean possession." She said, "In this case, the answer was not very complicated. The letter had been hidden for a very long time and had waited patiently to be found. And when it was found, its job was done. The job of the discoverer, my job, was to take the finding seriously, to follow the trail carefully, to handle the thing well and return it to where it wanted to go." She paused. One of the students, a young woman with the eager look of someone who has just realized that librarianship might be more interesting than she had thought, put up her hand. Did it feel like an intrusion? She asked. Finding it, reading it. Miriam considered this. The letter said, "For whoever finds this," she said, which I took as an invitation. I think, and this is my own view, which other librarians might reasonably dispute, that an item that has been deliberately hidden with a specific address to a future finder carries within it its own permission. It was asking to be found. It just needed to wait for the right person. The student thought about this. "And you were the right person?" she asked. "I was the person who was there," Miriam said. I think that's usually what the right person means. 3 weeks after her visit, she received a postcard. The front was a photograph of the Shropshire hills in autumn, the hills brown and gold and very wide under a pale sky. On the back, in handwriting she recognized immediately, "Dear Miriam, we have been thinking about your visit with a great deal of warmth. Tom has identified the flower you asked about from the description. It is the common meadow cranesbill, Geranium pratense, widespread in the region. The garden is going into its winter rest now, though he assures me it is not done yet. We hope you will come again in the spring, when it is at its best. The shortbread recipe is enclosed separately. There was no room on the card, Tom's doing, but I take some credit for the cardamom, which he resisted initially and now considers essential. With affection, Ruth. P.S. I read the letter again last night. The woman who wrote it was very young and very afraid, but not, I think, wrong about anything. R. Miriam read the postcard twice, which was becoming a habit. Then she pinned it above her desk in special collections, next to the notice board where she kept other things of importance. The cataloging schedule, a postcard from a colleague in Edinburgh, a small photograph of her own, the reference desk in the Bodleian, taken on her last day as a junior cataloger 22 years ago. Below the postcard, she placed a small note to herself. Ashford Carbonyl, spring. Then she turned back to her desk and her tea and the work of the day. On the last day of the Michaelmas term, Miriam arrived early as usual and made herself a cup of tea and stood for a moment in special collections before anyone else arrived, in the way she sometimes did, simply being in the room. It was a gray December morning, the first proper frost of the year on the ground outside. The windows steamed faintly at their lower edges. The room was quiet and orderly, the shelves in their usual rows, the rolling ladder on its brass rails, the green velvet armchair in the corner. The examination table was clear, everything filed and catalogued and in its place. She thought about the letter, about Ruth at 35, writing it by lamplight, folding it 4 times, tucking it into the book she had borrowed from this building. About the book sitting on a shelf here, holding the letter inside it for months or years before it was deaccessioned. About Edmund Halsworth carrying it home and shelving it in his study, not knowing what was inside, or perhaps knowing and keeping it for his own quiet reasons. About the box on the trolley and Daniel's footsteps and the slightly proud back board and the forewords. She thought about Thomas in his garden, learning the names of things. She thought about Ruth at the writing table, reading the letter with the expression of someone visiting their younger self. She thought about the shortbread, which had been very good. Libraries keep things. That was what they were for, not just the things put in them deliberately, cataloged and preserved with intention, but also the things that came in by accident, tucked into donated volumes, slipped between pages, folded into maps. The institutional memory that accumulates without anyone deciding that it should. The record of ordinary lives that the official histories don't include. The budget proposals for nature writing collections. The supportive letters written before proposals are even made. The departmental Christmas parties where two people stand slightly apart from the group and talk about something that makes one of them laugh. Libraries were, she thought, the right place for secrets. Not because they would keep them forever. Nothing was kept forever. But because they treated what was in their care with consistent, unflashy attention. The same quiet attention that she had given to the slightly proud backboard of a modest Victorian field guide. And that had turned out, in the end, to be the right kind of attention to give. She finished her tea. The morning was starting. She could hear the building beginning its day, the front doors opening, the heating cycling up, the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor. She put her cup down and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote at the top, "Notes toward a history of the departmental library, English and Comparative Literature, Caldwell University, 1973 to 001. Based on archival research and interview." She thought for a moment, the pen in her hand. Then she wrote, "Ruth Calloway arrived at Caldwell University in 1973 and remained for 28 years, leaving in 2001. She built the departmental library from a modest working collection into one of the best used resources in the faculty. She left the library in a condition of good order, with thorough documentation, which is perhaps the most appropriate way a librarian can bid farewell to a place. She paused. Then she added, she also, in 1984, hidden a letter in a library book, which the library kept faithfully for 40 years, and which was found on a Tuesday morning in October 2024, which turned out to be exactly the right time for it to be found. She closed the notebook. Outside, the December morning was brightening slightly, the frost on the ground catching the early light. The horse chestnut was bare and still, its branches clear against the pale sky, the shape of it visible in a way that the full summer leaves had not allowed. The skeleton revealed, clean and exact, the structure that had held the whole thing up all along. She went to the window and looked out at it for a moment. Then she went back to her desk and her work and the long and satisfying business of keeping things well. The end. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our story. Somewhere near Ludlow, in a stone house with a blue door and a garden full of things with names, two people are sleeping. The hills are quiet around them. The last of the season's roses are finished, but the structure of the garden remains, ready for spring. In a university library, in the special collections room with its high shelves and its rolling ladder and its green velvet armchair, a letter is no longer hidden. It has been read. It has been understood. It has been returned to the person who wrote it, who turned out, after all these years, not to need it anymore, but was glad to have it back. And in the archive, a catalog entry records the provenance of a modest Victorian field guide in faded green cloth. Common wildflowers of the British Isles. Bracewell, 1887. The entry is careful and complete, as provenance records should be. It includes a note about the letter that was found inside it, and where the letter went, and who found it, and what they did with it. Libraries keep things. This is one of the things they have kept. Let your breathing slow now, if it is not already. Let your thoughts settle, the way thoughts settle at the end of a long day, finding their natural resting places. Let the story sit with you gently, not something to hold tightly, but something to carry you into sleep, like the sound of rain on a high window, like the smell of old paper and beeswax and autumn air. The library is quiet. The shelves are full. Everything is in its place. Sleep well, dear listener. I'll be here when you're ready to begin again.